Welcome back, everyone, to Conversations Live. I'm your host, Cyrus Webb. Glad you all could join us once again. I'm excited to welcome Owen Symes to our program today. Owen is celebrating a new book that is really fascinating look not only about Barack Obama and his presidency, but also what was happening in the world and how it shaped him and how he shaped it. The book is called He Was Our Man in Washington, a history of the Obama years. We'll talk to Owen not only about the writing of the book, the research he did to kind of write this book and to bring it all together, but also what he hopes as you as a reader are able to take away from it. Owen, thank you so much for the time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Owen, I think one of the things I did not expect when I started reading the book, and again, we're going to let our audience know how they can get it, is how much you kind of take us back not only into history and how it kind of led to where we were with the Obama years, but also how history in many ways and what was happening in the world kind of shaped the Obama years. What was it like for you to look at those two things as you looked at his presidency?
Sure. So that was really very startling for me to look at. You know, when the 2016 election happened, and I'm sure, like many people, I was very surprised at the result, right? Even Republicans weren't quite sure Trump was going to win. So I decided first to look at, okay, well, what happened with his immediate predecessor? Maybe Obama's years in office can tell us something about how Trump managed to get in. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there are these very long threads of history that go back decades, generations, almost the founding of the country sometimes, if not further back. And so after kind of researching that, I wanted to try to include that for the reader so that they would have a better context through which to judge a contemporary president. Because I think so often in our politics, we have a very shallow view of these things. You know, we'll look at just Bill Clinton or just Obama or just Trump, as if these people exist and commit themselves to politics in a vacuum, right? So I don't think you can look at Trump without looking at Obama, without looking at Clinton, without looking at Bush. You know, these are very old institutions at this point, and there's a lot of bureaucratic inertia, institutional inertia, that's going to sometimes hamstring, sometimes help the kinds of policies you want to put in place, you know, kind of regardless of the campaign rhetoric.
Yeah. It's funny hearing you just say that, Owen, because one of the things I thought about with the book is even you talk about this, and He Was Our Man in Washington, was how much, even when it came to policy, I mean, when you're looking at Obama, you still have to go back to, I mean, not only, of course, things that Clinton did when he was in office, but also, as you mentioned, Bush as well. Do you think that was one of the surprises for people when he was in office, as much as he was looked at as being a person of change, how in many ways he was not?
Yeah, I think it was very surprising for people on the left, especially, and I think people on the right, you know, a lot of conservatives, Pat Buchanans of the world, they didn't want to see it. They took Obama's rhetoric at face value and just kind of ran with it. They allowed their fear of change to cloud how they viewed his actual presidency. And so you can see the antecedents of a lot of what Obama ended up trying to do, you know, pulling from Mitt Romney's playbook when he tries to reform healthcare, or pulling from George Bush's playbook when he's fighting the war on terror, or the playbook of Bill Clinton. You can see it in who he chooses to have around him. A lot of his advisors and cabinet ministers and what have you were former Clinton officials, even some former Bush officials. I mean, we forget, but his first Secretary of Defense was Robert Gates. That was a holdover from the Bush administration that Obama deliberately kept in place to give people a sense of continuity, because he understood people are afraid of change. So, you know, fair play to Obama. That's a very politically savvy thing to do, at least in a vacuum. Obviously, there were other factors that kind of prevented that from being as effective as it could have been, but certainly that was his attempt. And as for being a change maker, I was thinking a lot about that. I just finally finished reading Obama's memoirs. I mean, the thing's 900 pages, and there's a lot of ground to cover there. And I was very struck by, at the beginning of the book, there's a lot of talk about you know, he's a community organizer. He's trying to institute change. He wants to go into politics because he wants to have a larger impact on the world than just fixing community problems, you know, a tenant strike or a boycott or whatever, which, you know, that's admirable. He gets into office, especially as president, and he comes against all of these institutional roadblocks. And I think also he begins to assimilate the worldview of the institution. So there's a lot of talk about, well, as much as I sympathized with the protesters in Egypt in 2010, for instance, as president, I still have to take into account all these geopolitical considerations that are kind of above and beyond, what a progressive, radical, however you want to characterize his former political life, might care about. Mubarak might be brutal, but he's also quote-unquote stable. He's someone we understand. These aren't the kinds of changes I think a lot of people expected.
I think, and I think that is what is so interesting. And it's funny, I have to say, Owen, this was not planned. So when I went to actually post about your interview today, I did not realize two things. One, I did not realize the conversation about this being Obama's 60th birthday, but also about the conversation about this being the Biden administration being the third term. That's what's trending right now, as we're having this conversation on Twitter right now. So, and I think it is an interesting thing, and not necessarily about the birthday, but about the third term, in that there are some similarities we're seeing in what happened with the passing of, as people like to call it, Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, and what we see happening with the infrastructure plan right now, and the partisanship that is playing its role. Do you think that is one of the things that people now have just gotten used to, Owen, as you were doing your research for this book, that that is just a part of what is to be expected when there's someone in office with a slim majority at times, that there are going to be people who just will refuse to compromise and to work together?
Yeah, that was one of the very striking things. You can see antecedents to this in the Clinton administration, especially with the vitriol surrounding his impeachment inquiry and that kind of thing. But when Clinton veered to the right, gutting welfare, promoting a budget surplus, promoting these austerity measures, Republicans, by and large, sided with him, or at least enough to get pretty sizable congressional majorities. When the 1994 crime bill was passed through that Biden helped orchestrate, there were a good size of the GOP voted with the Clinton administration on that. So, Clinton starts out with healthcare reform, which Republicans don't want, and so they kind of crucify him there. But as soon as he veers to the right, he gets a fair bit of support. Now, you compare that to Obama 15 years later, and we can see that the partisanship that you saw kindling under Newt Gingrich, metastasized with the racist element against Obama, and really hardened, into this adamantine kind of partisanship. And I think, obviously, even though Biden is a white man, that mindset has continued among many of the Republican Party. So you see people like Mitt Romney, who 15 years ago would have been considered a pretty conservative guy. He's now in the moderate end of the GOP because he's even willing to listen to something that a Democrat has to say. So yeah, that partisanship has been building for decades. It got really bad under Obama, and it doesn't seem like it's getting any better under Biden.
Another thing that comes up in the book that I want to talk to you about is the issue of climate change. Again, it is one of those things that, again, we find in the news today. Oh, and I want to say for those who are just tuning in, though, either on the radio side or online, you're listening to Conversations Live. We're excited to welcome Owen Symes to our program today. Owen is the author of the new book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. So you talk about, of course, what was happening when it came to Obama in office and the conversation around climate change. A lot of this is in Chapter 5 of the book for our audience out there that is making notes about it, and we'll be reminding you all how you can get your own copy. Talk to us about that conversation, because even as you kind of talk about, even in the book, Owen, the what we know from science, but still what is still a big debate right now when it comes to people, especially in positions of power, about this topic. What was it like for you to look at how this, again, is one of those situations where it doesn't look like much has changed over the years?
Sure. So one of the things I tried to concentrate on when I was researching this is, on an institutional level, who stands to benefit from the status quo? Because I think climate change deniers are often trying to find some kind of financial reason why scientists might think that the climate is warming, and some kind of nefarious reason for trying to upend the status quo in some way, which is incorrect, but it's a legitimate concern. Like a lot of these, like vaccine deniers are another example. There's a legitimate reason why you want to be skeptical of what authorities say, what scientists say, but then you actually have to look at the evidence and realize that if the scientists, what they're saying, if the evidence backs that up, well, then your skepticism was unwarranted in that situation and you move on with your life. So when I was researching climate change, what I found was precisely the opposite of what the climate deniers say. The institutional benefit for maintaining the status quo is where the money is, because that's where the oil companies are and the fossil fuel companies. And then you branch out a little bit further, defense contractors. Huge swaths of our economy are based on petroleum products one way or another. As it turns out, academic research at the UN or funded by very small bits of the federal budget don't make up a large portion of our economic activity, but ExxonMobil does. So that's where I think a lot of the roadblocks come into it, because just like with tobacco smoking in the 50s and 60s, the fossil fuel companies have poured billions of dollars into suppressing the information, twisting the information, and then when they couldn't do either of those things, just blackballing the scientists that are saying these things, right? So, I mean, I mentioned this in the book. In the 1980s, I think it was Exxon, they actually had internal scientists looking at climate change, and they said, the evidence is still a little bit shaky right now because it's the 1980s and we hadn't studied it that much, but we do think this could be a real problem. This needs more research, and if this is a real problem, we're going to have to completely rethink our business model. And the Exxon execs took that scientific report and just tossed it into the darkest corner of their archives. It wasn't until 30 years later, after a lot of litigation and investigation, that those kinds of reports came to light. They knew this was a problem. And it seems to me that if the oil companies know it's a problem, what debate is there left, at least on a political level? Like, we can argue scientifically about what specific weather event is tied to what specific part of the climate change phenomenon, but even the people who stand to benefit from doing nothing realize that it's a problem, and they've realized it for decades.
And now, of course, we're hearing more and more about the impact, even as you outline in the book. I mean, and so let's talk about that for a moment. Give us a timeline here, Owen, for those who are just now finding out about the book. When did you start writing it? When was it completed?
Sure. So I first started doing a little bit of research here and there in 2017, part-time, while I was working. And then after about a year of that, my economic situation was relatively stable. My wife had just graduated with a master's in speech therapy, so she had a good job. So I took that opportunity to quit my job and devote myself to writing this full time. By that point, I had researched the majority of stuff on the War on Terror. I had a rough draft of that chapter written. I had an outline of the economic stuff. So that first year was part-time research. And then the second year I devoted to researching the other chapters of the book: healthcare reform, Obama and race, other marginal struggles with gay liberation and trans liberation, climate change, and then a small chapter at the end on his interaction with indigenous peoples, mostly with the pipeline fights at the end of his administration. So it took about 2.5 years to research and write. One of those years was full-time.
Gotcha. And did you find that the reason why I was curious about that and the timeline and what was happening in the world during that time was, did you find that the motivation of the book changed along that way, Owen, or was this the book that you intended to write from the beginning?
So my intent from the beginning was to try and figure out how Trump got elected. So when I first started looking at Obama, that's kind of what I was looking for. Like, how did we get to this kind of strange situation where we have a reality TV star as president? So the book I ended up writing was much broader than that, because as I was researching it, I noticed that no one was really writing about Obama anymore. Trump had kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the environment. And so I thought, well, I wasn't intent on writing a book about Obama. U.S. history had never been a huge interest of mine when I was in college, for instance. But I felt that I was doing the research. I was becoming the expert on this topic. No one else seemed to be writing about it. So I ended up putting as much as I could fit into that book. Obviously, there's more that I could have covered and wish I had, but time is always a problem there. I wanted to get the book out while it was still timely, that kind of thing. So, right. Although, as far as I'm aware, no other books about Obama besides his memoir have been released. So far, I've cornered the market. I'm a good capitalist, I guess, even though I criticize that system.
Well, a little capitalism is always good. So I want to ask you then about the response, because, it is, again, the interesting thing for me, and again, I didn't know in some aspects what to expect when I first heard about the book, and shout out to our friend Javier Perez at Page Turner Publicity for first telling me about it. And when I got to reading it, it's not the book that I thought it was going to be, but I did think it was such an interesting book in connecting the dots. For one thing, I think and this is my opinion, I'm curious to see your thoughts about this as a reader, talking to the author, and it really shows how much we put on elected officials that may not even be appropriate or realistic, but also the limitations that elected official, Democrat or Republican, and what they can actually do when it comes to enacting change in the country. So I'm curious about that. Has that been part of the conversation you've been hearing or not?
Yeah, for sure. Most of the criticism I've received so far has been relatively positive. The book is still young, so most of what I'm hearing is from, I think, people that were excited to read it. So hopefully as the publicity comes, I'll get more negative criticism, and then I can hone my craft, right? But definitely I've been talking to people about, what do we even expect from a president? Because you're right, we put a lot of pressure, at least initially, on these people. Trump is another great example. One of the reasons he got so many working class votes compared to Clinton is because he painted himself as an outsider, right? Now, obviously, he was lying through his teeth the whole time. He was a charlatan and remains a charlatan. But the fact of the matter was that campaign promise, that his version of hope and change, just a little more crass, still electrified some people, right? So there is something to be said for the fact that we put a lot of pressure on these individual politicians, not really understanding the institutional morass that they have to navigate. Congress and the president and the judiciary, they've been around for almost, 200 plus years, almost 250. These are old institutions. They have their own ways of doing things. They have their own set of priorities and their own interests to defend. And you combine that with the fact that corporations these days run a large portion of our political process, especially since recent Supreme Court decisions have allowed money to just flow as it never has before. Spending money is political speech now, apparently, which sounds great until you realize that means that someone who's a billionaire has a greater right to free speech than the rest of us. It's somewhat troubling in a democracy where one vote is supposed to have equal weight. But point being, the book does speak to the limitations, not only of what an individual can accomplish, but how the context in which they operate is going to limit what they're able to do, how they're able to think about these things. That's what's called the Overton window. What is an acceptable kind of idea to have in a given society in a given moment, right? So in the 1930s, there was a very large, very active, very healthy Communist Party in this country that helped push FDR farther to the left with Social Security and labor reforms of the Wagner Act and stuff. But in the 50s, that wasn't okay anymore. That movement got crushed. 50 years later, the quote-unquote left in this country has never really recovered from that. So most of the ideas that we tend to talk about in the political and economic realm tend to be ideas from the right end of the spectrum. And we see this even with Obama, with the best example of that being healthcare. At the beginning, he talked a little bit about the public option, but he didn't defend it very much. The idea that the government could come in as at least the consumer of last resort and be able to sell people some kind of insurance if no private provider was able to do that, right? So Obama didn't really care about that very much, but he did care a lot about market incentives, profit incentives, the kinds of things that a businessman might care about, but maybe a doctor or a healthcare provider not so much, right? Like in theory, profit shouldn't really factor into healthcare very much, but in the Obamacare legislation, it really does. So that's the kind of acceptable discourse at the top of the political pyramid that we're able to have, But if that changes, like with Bernie Sanders, talking more about quote unquote socialism and that kind of thing, that might change the kind of legislation that a Joe Biden or whoever is in office might be able to push through.
It is a fascinating conversation, Owen. I'm so glad we have your book to kind of be there, to kind of be a part of this conversation as we're moving forward. Again, everyone, Owen Symes has been our guest. The book is He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. It is available now through our friends at Amazon.com. And, Owen, how can our audience stay connected with you?
Sure. So the most succinct way to do that, the easiest way to stay connected with me is on Twitter at Owen_Symes, SYMES. I'm on there pretty often, poking around. So that's the best way. You can also find me on Facebook at Owen D. Symes. The regular Owen Symes is already taken. There's some guy in New Zealand. I'm going to have a talk to him about that. But yeah, and you can find my book at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound. If you don't want to give Jeff Bezos more money, you can get from a local bookstore. I always recommend that.
Yeah, got you. Well, Owen, congratulations to you again. So glad to have you on with us and looking forward to our next conversation together.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Cyrus, and you have a good one.
You as well, man. And we think it's a great segment of Conversations Live. Until next time, I'm your host, Cyrus Webb.